Generation C. Who the hell are Generation C? Okay, well, let's just remind ourselves. Firstly, they are digital natives. That is, they love communicating digitally through different mediums. Second thing is, it's a state of mind, and as such, Generation C are the first generation in history that are ageless, not bound by a demographic. And as such, they are growing as more and more people want to communicate digitally. They're a growing generation. And so many people ask me, what's the difference between Generation C and Generation Y? Okay, and in this we're going to briefly explain the relationship between those two and also explain who Generation Y really are. Okay, now, Generation Y are a demographic generation. So if you speak to the two authorities on Generation Y, one of them is a guy called Pearce, who is an amazing speaker, and he's written a book called Generation Y, and it's basically based on his own personal experience of Generation Y. And the key thing is this. He says basically they're a very selfish generation, but if you manage them appropriately, they can produce amazing results. So this is very much a piece about how to manage them, and based on his personal experience. By contrast, Howe and Strauss, who use the term millennials, we'll come to that in a minute, but we'll use the term Generation Y, they make the demographics slightly different. It's only 3 years different, okay? So they're basically talking about the same demographic. They say these people here are a hero generation. That is to say, every so often you get a generation who comes along who changes history. So a hero generation was America, and after the Second World War, where America became the primary power. And so Howe and Strauss say, every about 4 generations you get a generation that's a hero generation. So the takeout from this is, basically the headline is, Howe and Strauss reckon they're really selfless and they have lots of stats and facts and figures to produce it. Whereas Sheahan, talking on the basis of experience, says they're really selfish. Now here's the question, why? Are two people who are clearly authorities in their field saying such different things about essentially the same demographic? And just to make things even more confusing, and I'm sorry to do this to you, they're also known as millennials, obviously. Don't label us. Generation Y, or Generation Y, as in WHY, Generation Tech, Generation Next, Generation.com, Generation 2000, Echo Boom, Echo Boomers, Boomer Babies, Generation XX. So there are loads of different names for these people. So it's actually really confusing. But the main thing is this, that they're a demographic, and as such, they're an old-fashioned way of defining a generation. They are a group of people who have basically a common experience of grown up and have a common experience of culture at a certain time, okay? So here's the question, why are these two people writing about something, the same demographic, and yet their conclusions are so different? You've got to stop and ask that. And the reason this is really important is because marketing is based on the idea of a target market. The idea that a group of people that are demographic are essentially the same, have the same sort of values and behaviours, and as such we can target them. Here's the problem in a nutshell. In the 1950s, it's a high-tech diagram, where this squiggle represents culture, there was only so much culture, there was less stuff for people to have access to, and primarily it was through mass media. People used to talk about soaps, they used to talk about television shows. As such, they had more of a sense of commonality. Here, what's happened is that culture has exploded. There's so much more stuff out there. It's much harder for people to have commonality. And the result of that means that the idea of a demographic generation based on a box is much harder. And the implications of that are really profound, and they're two. The first is the idea of a target market is basically still used by marketeers on a constant basis, even though we've constantly said that it's harder to use it. There's no viable alternative. Well, here is the viable alternative. What we as marketeers should be doing is using the idea of target influencers. And we'll come on to that next time. But the basic relation Generation C and Generation Y is this. You can be both. You can be Generation C psychographically and Generation Y demographically. Equally, if you're not into communicating digitally and you're not an influencer in the digital world, you are likely to be Generation Y. In other words, you can be Generation Y or be dual generational. And with that, and it's slightly longer than usual, for which I'm sorry, we'll say goodbye and come and look at another relationship with a generation next time.